Matthew 12, verses 1 through 14. This is the context of Jesus' question. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry. They began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, and yet they remain guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means," and then he quotes, "I desire mercy and not sacrifice," end quote. If you had known what that means, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he went on from there. He entered into their synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So where is all this even coming from? This, contextually, this is a bit odd. If you don't understand ancient Judaism, Matthew 12 is an interesting chapter. Let me fill you in a little bit. The Pharisees have oral tradition. That means they made rules that they spoke and taught one to the other in their little clique, their Pharisaical schools. And through this schooling and education as a Pharisee, you were taught all of these what are called Mishnaic teachings because they're found in the Mishnah. Well, the Mishnah, a portion of it is dedicated to the Sabbath. And in the Mishnah Shabbat 7, verse 2, there's a list of Sabbath activities that are forbidden. And the list is common in Judaism. It's 40 less 1. 40 less 1, which is 39. So in Pharisaical teaching, in their oral tradition, this is not in the Bible, but it's in the Mishnah. Okay? So if you came from a church that had like a book of common prayer, something like that, it would be similar. So it's a religious text that helps you be a better person in your faith, but it's not actually part of the Bible. So they have that, and it's called the Mishnah. In that Mishnah Shabbat 7:2, there's a list of 39 activities that are forbidden on the Sabbath. The Sabbath being the day of rest. Shabbat means 7. The seventh day is Saturday. Saturday is a day of rest on the Jewish calendar. Every Saturday is a day of rest for the Jewish people. On that day, here's a list of 39 things you cannot do. Okay, in that list, there are 2 points that are pretty significant to what Jesus is dealing with. Before we mention those, I want to point out that this isn't a strange thing. Because if you hear all of that, you might think, wow, ancient Jewish people were a little odd, that they had these, all these rules and extra books that they had to study and things like that. But that's really not strange at all, because I would guess that you live your entire life with a bunch of man-made rules. In fact, that's part of living life. We almost have to make rules for every generation to follow, for people to function correctly in society. Rules are not inherently bad. My household has rules. My kids have rules. I'm imagining any of you who are parents, you have rules. If you were a kid, you had rules. You were all children once. Let me raise your hand if you had rules in your house that you did not understand at times. That's okay. Don't be ashamed. I didn't say if you broke the rules. I mean, I'm sure you'd all keep your hands up, but just if you had the rules, right? Okay, keep them up if you broke the rules. All right. I appreciate the honesty. Yeah. Well, some of the rules you break because you don't understand what the rules are there for. And I think that's commonplace, even among the ancient Jews, that there were Pharisaical traditions, rules, man-made rules, that may have been good in their intention, but at times became frustrating or even debilitating, crippling to the action of genuine faith. So what we're going to find out is that these rules make it hard to honor the Sabbath the way you're supposed to. Rules that were supposed to protect the Sabbath make it near impossible to actually honor or do the Sabbath. And I think that's important. So here's an example, picking grain. There are rules against picking grain or cooking. You're not allowed to cook anything on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to pick grain or harvest grain. And there may have been a caveat eventually that if you're near death, someone's starving to death, they can, do whatever they need to do to stay alive. But that's basically it. Same thing with the synagogue. He goes into the synagogue, and there's a man with a withered hand. That's what we just read. There's a man with a withered hand. Jesus says, stretch out your hand, which is exactly what this man could not do, right? That's the one thing he can't do is stretch out his hand. It's withered. And Jesus says, do it, stretch it out. And he stretches his hand out, and it's healed. It's a miracle, except one of those 39 rules is that you cannot heal on the Sabbath unless it is a life or death emergency. So if there's a life-threatening problem, someone's bleeding out, you could try to heal them. But a withered hand does not count. So Jesus has now broken 2 of those 39 rules in just a few verses. And then, almost in spite, he tells a story, a parable, a very short parable about a sheep. He says, if a sheep falls into a hole, which one of you wouldn't pull it out? Which one of you wouldn't try to save a sheep? And do you not think people are more important than sheep? Now, sheep, for the Pharisees and for ancient people in general, represented business income. They did not have sheep the way that you have labradoodles. Sheep were not like household pets, right? People cared for their animals. Many of them had affection for their animals if they were good shepherds. But at the end of the day, that sheep was raised for harvest, right? It was income, and their families depended on that. Whether it was the wool or the meat or whatever they used it for, they needed those sheep for income. So if a sheep falls in a hole, you can't just leave it there until the next day. It's going to be injured. It's going to get sick. It might even die, and that's business income. So you rescue the sheep. Jesus is essentially saying, aren't people more important than your stuff, your money, your income? You would risk breaking the Sabbath, or even in your 39 laws, you would make caveats that you could rescue something if it affects your business income, but you can't help someone who's suffering? You can do something to alleviate a threat to your business, but you can't alleviate another human's suffering on the Sabbath. And by insinuation, he's saying, do you even know what the Sabbath is for? Which is something I want you to think about this morning. What is the Sabbath, and what is it for? Now, the Qumran community, do you remember learning about the Qumran scrolls, or the Dead Sea Scrolls? They're also called that. You ever heard of that? You can just kind of nod your heads. Okay. So they were discovered in, I think, the 40s or 50s of just the last century, 1900s. And since then, we've gained a much greater understanding of a community of ascetic people who lived sort of outside of town, kind of like the Amish today, something like that. They lived in this separate community, and we call them the Qumran community. They had some rules that were a little bit different than the Pharisees. And they did away with this problem by saying you can't do either one. You can't pull a sheep out of a hole or heal a person. So, that's one way to fix it, is just add even more rules to cancel out the contradiction. I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. Jesus doesn't teach the Sabbath doesn't matter, or that you could go ahead and just work on the Sabbath, who cares? So he's not getting rid of the Sabbath, but he's also not making it more strict. He's trying to do something different. In fact, I think what he's doing is redefining Sabbath. Or instead of redefining, he's reminding people what it was always meant to be. The Sabbath hasn't changed. It's just human interpretation changes. Sabbath has always been a day of rest for God's people. But why? Because the physical day of rest corresponds with a spiritual experience of growth or healing. The physical day of rest, the Sabbath, always is meant to correspond with a period of growth or healing spiritually. The Sabbath was never meant simply to be a day off of work. It was a day dedicated to God. The problem is the rules that the Pharisees have added to the Sabbath have made it near impossible to experience spiritual growth or healing. They have literally made it illegal to heal someone on the Sabbath. Are you understanding why this is a bit of a contradiction? Okay, so we would call this, anybody have a word you would use for this when people make man-made rules in their religion? You know it. Silly. That's a good one. I was saying it starts with an L. I was thinking more of like the official term for it. It is silly, though. Okay, I heard a bunch of people say it. Legalism, which is basically making the law more important than compassion and grace and goodness. It's not so much about doing what is just, it's about following the rules, which is a really immature way to look at the world. So I want to talk about legalism because sheep falling into holes. I mean, I know some of you do have sheep. This is Gallia County. There are cattle and sheep and things. But, many of us don't raise sheep. I don't. I grew up in the inner city. I don't even know how to raise a sheep. Whatever. I do. I think they're cool. So, let's make this relevant because I don't heal people's withered hands. I don't pick grain directly from a field that hasn't been harvested. And I don't have a sheep. So what I do understand is wearing short pants to church because I've been yelled at for that. So, or wearing your ball cap in the assembly for worship, right? Having a ball cap on when you're in this room. Or, and now I'm starting to trigger people, or eating or drinking coffee in the sanctuary of a church. May it never be, God forbid. I'm trying not to look anybody in the eyes. Maybe it's women wearing pants. That's not, of course, a rule here, but it is often practiced in some places. Maybe it's drinking alcohol. Now, I mean in moderation. So I do a lot of work with addiction. If you don't know that, I do a lot of work with addiction and with those who have experienced addiction. We're not promoting the immoderate use of substances, but prescribed drugs, moderate use of alcohol for those with self-control. We know the Bible doesn't forbid those things, and yet lots of churches have flat-out rules. You can't touch a drop of alcohol. They never seem to have a rule about going through McDonald's drive-thru, though, which I think is just as unhealthy, right? Playing cards. Anybody grow up in a church where you weren't allowed to play cards? Maybe even board games or things that could be considered close to gambling. God forbid, pool, billiards. Do you know our youth room has a billiards table? And we had, now I can say this because we worked it out. This was several years back. But when that pool table was donated to the church, we had families that left. And then we had to basically go beg them to come back. That's legalism. Those families are wonderful people. Their intentions were good, but they were raised to think about rules that aren't biblical. And I told them, and they didn't like it, but I told them, the first time I see a teenager put out a cigar on the table and throw some hundreds on the table, I will tell them they have to get rid of it. Because in their mind, the church was turning into a billiards hall where kids would smoke and gamble and waste away in sin. And I had to remind them, this is like a game that some wealthy people have in their basement if they're lucky, right? That's how I grew up thinking of it. My friends we didn't have a basement. My friends who had basements might have a pool table and we could go play pool in their basement. I never thought of it as a billiards hall because I'm 32. That's a generational thing. I get it. I see the intention behind the rule. And maybe 50 years ago, that rule would have been more effective or more helpful because billiards halls were places where a lot of corruption took place. But that's not the world we live in today, so that rule doesn't apply the same way. Is that making sense? It's not like the rules never mattered. Rules matter, and they are created for a reason, almost always. But sometimes rules need to change. God's truth is unwavering, unchanging. That's why God doesn't make a whole bunch of rules. God makes a few timeless truths about, like don't murder. That's a pretty good one. I don't think that's ever going to change. Don't steal what isn't yours. That's never going to change. Don't wear shorts to church. That's, what if it's 95 degrees and, mid-July and you're going to Wednesday night Bible study and you've been outside working on a motorcycle all afternoon and then you come to Bible study and you just want to wear a pair of khaki shorts and a polo and boat shoes and think this is a nice outfit. And then somebody slams their Bible shut and says, how dare you desecrate the house of the Lord, and leaves your Bible study. Not like that ever happened to me, but if it did, even if it happened to me like 6 years ago, I definitely would still remember it because it would have hurt my feelings. Some of my friends are laughing because they know that exact story happened. Dancing? You better not dance. If I find out that you dance, you'll be out of this church so quick. Yeah, of course, I have daughters that, they're very small, but they're learning ballet. Their teacher goes to this church. I have kids in the back probably dancing right now to worship music about Jesus, of course, waving their hands around and jumping up and down and making motions and all the things they come in here and do at Vacation Bible School. And guess what? It's teaching them to have fun when they're at church worshiping God. And I don't think any of us are going to bat an eye at that, because we know today that kind of dancing is totally wholesome. When kids are jumping up and down praising Jesus, that's great. We know what kind of dancing might not be great. We're not going to install any long metal poles on the stage in church. There's some limits. There are some limits. I need to stick to my notes. Okay. All right, then, I want to mention one more, loud music and drums. Drums, I ought to burn these things. Did you know out of all the instruments on the stage, the only ones we know for certain they used in the Hebrew Jewish faith, I'm talking before Jesus, the only instrument we know out of all these that they actually did play and use were these instruments right here. The ones which ironically people get the most angry about. If there were a rule that we should only use instruments found in the Bible, it would just be drums and maybe a lyre, like a small harp, which I think is a lot like a guitar, so same difference. So we just have drums and guitar. Technically, a piano is kind of like a lyre with hammers that hit the strings. I don't know. The more you think about it, you could have pretty much all these instruments. But maybe that's my point, isn't it? That these rules they're just people's preferences oftentimes that have been enacted over and over again so that they become tradition, and tradition carries weight. Now, that tradition may seem silly with some of these things. Maybe for you, some of these things are very serious, and that's valid, especially depending on how you were raised. For me, almost every one of these is a laughable thing. I can joke about it, but there are some from my experience that are not as funny, some that are more concerning. For example, required celibacy for a priest or a bishop. In many traditions of Christianity, some of the largest, it's required that the leaders of a church remain celibate. That's not biblical. It's encouraged by the Apostle Paul at one moment, but it's not a biblical rule, and yet it is a rule in some churches. Or paying penance when you've committed sin and saying certain prayers a certain amount of times. That's not in the Bible. It's not necessarily bad. Praying is certainly not bad. When you've sinned, you know what you should do? Pray. That's a good answer. But it's not mandated in Scripture that you pray a certain thing a certain amount of times. Or, now I'm really going to push people's buttons, what about a sinner's prayer or an altar call? And if you want to know more about the history of some of those things, come to Wednesday night Bible study. We're studying different denominations and where they come up with some of their practices. But I can tell you a sinner's prayer and an altar call didn't exist before the 1800s. No church anywhere ever did either one of those things until the 1800s. And even then, only revivalistic movements did them. They're not bad. There's nothing inherently wrong with saying a prayer about your sin and asking Jesus to come into your life and into your heart. Nothing about that is wrong. Just like coming up to an altar for prayer and support isn't wrong. There's nothing wrong about it. You're welcome to do that here if you want to. But these are just man-made traditions. But once they're practiced enough times, people consider them gospel truth. They're necessary. We've had families leave this church because we don't do enough altar calls and sinner's prayers. If only they knew the history behind it. There's a lot of Pharisaism. That's a hard word to say. Pharisaicism. I have a lisp already. That word is death to me. I really got worked up with the legalism stuff. Okay, so let me explain why this is so significant in the life of the church. Legalism happens, and this is why some people don't like me as a preacher, because I ask why too much. But that's how you cure legalism. When you stop asking what or how, and you ask why. Now, we're taught not to do that. My kids are taught every day to quit doing that. You don't ask me why, you just do what I say. I'll tell you what or how, that's all you need to know. Just do what I say, how I say it. And when they say, but why do we have to do that? I say, I don't know, because I said so, just do it. Golly, quit asking me so many questions. We're trained, and you're laughing because you know that's how it works. As a child, you're trained not to ask why. Then when Jesus says, you must ask why, our defenses come up. Wait, you can't ask why. And who do you ask why? And what if they won't tell you? Like that parent when you're 5 and you say, well, why can't I do that? And the parent's like, because I said so, and I'm the dad. I'm telling you. What if the preacher says that? Because I'm the pastor and I told you. because we're the elder board, because the bishop says so, because it's what we've always done. And they don't tell you why. What do you do with that? Well, most people just say, okay, because that's what they've done their whole lives since they were children. And they just keep doing the what and the how without ever considering why. Is this clicking? Is that making sense for anybody? So the cure to legalism is questioning authority. And guess what Jesus did all over the Gospels? He questioned the powers that existed. That's why they killed him. You realize they didn't kill Jesus because he healed a bunch of people. They didn't kill him because he fed a bunch of people. They killed him because he questioned the authority of those who held power. And that tradition continues, that those faithful Christians who question why in this world are often crucified, whether physically or more often socially. They're left out to dry. Hung out to dry, whatever the phrase is, whatever. You get what I'm saying. They're mistreated. Parenting's hard. We have rules for a reason. I have rules in my house. Whether my kids know why or not isn't really the point. When they're little, they just need to follow the rules because I've made the rules to protect them, to help them. As they grow older, they can understand why, and they might decide the rules don't apply in some situations. And I think that's okay. One of the things we're dealing with right now is when it's okay to tattle. Because, my kids are at that age where it's always, he did this, she did that, blah, 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 blah. And I just want to say, I don't care. I actually do say, I don't care. And just this morning, Ada said to me, and I said, I don't care. And she went, but you said, I said, I don't care. I don't care. I'm just trying to get dressed for church. Go, brush your teeth. I don't care. But the other day, I told that story about the river, when the river was really high. I'm just trying to be vulnerable, guys. I'm a human. Many of you are much better than me. But when she came in and said, oh yeah, Hudson and Mirabel are down looking at the river behind the neighbor's house, I screamed at her and said, why didn't you tell me that? And she probably thought, because you told me to quit tattling on them. And that's Jesus. That's God, right? That's God's frustration, is that he has to give us rules, but then sometimes I think he's frustrated that we don't have the common sense to know when the rule does or doesn't apply. Like Sabbath rest. Yes, you need rest, but if there's someone suffering, you can help that person. Come on. You think that's what I didn't want you to do, is help someone in need? You think that's what Sabbath is about, is ignoring people's need? It's tough. Parenting's hard, and God, as a heavenly parent, gets it. God gets it. People often, in God's case, they forsake his direct commands, the rules he did make. What's annoying for God is that they don't honor the rules he made, and then they make up a bunch of their own rules and try to force them on everybody. It's very irritating. Very irritating. That could be its own sermon, but I think that's often why Christianity seems childish or immature to a lot of people in the world, because it is. It's a bunch of how and what without ever asking why. It is shallow. Jesus, he doesn't argue with these people about the oral traditions, about their law. He doesn't say, your laws are dumb or you shouldn't believe any of that. He doesn't have to do that. He just simply quotes scripture to justify his actions. And even then, he doesn't quote examples that fit his experience. He quotes David and his mighty men of valor, these valiant soldiers. He quotes a story about them going and eating from the table of showbread, which was not allowed. That's desecration of the temple. And yet David, the king, who's not a priest, David and his soldiers are allowed to go in and eat that bread without consequence. Why? Because they were starving, because they were so hungry. And it's bread. It's just going to go to waste. So they ate it. And Jesus says, guess what happened to them after they did that? Nothing. Nothing. Because that's not what God cared about. He wasn't worried about the bread. He cared more about those people getting some food after their long day of traveling and fighting and everything else they were up to. Then he tells another story. And basically, in this story, he's referring to what happens every week in the synagogue and in the temple, when the things that are holy and sacred become desecrated by the priest. Because guess who has to put all that stuff out and clean it and set it up and then take it all back down again? The priests. They have to do all their work on the Lord's Day, on the Sabbath. And yet they don't get in any trouble for it. Because common sense says somebody's got to do that, so we've set aside these people to do this work. So every Sabbath, they get to break the rules, and they get away with it because there is a greater purpose. Generally speaking, if you speed on the highway, you are liable to get a speeding ticket. But if in the passenger seat next to you is someone bleeding out to death and you're rushing them to the emergency room, usually a decent officer is going to escort you the rest of the way and help you get into the ER. They're not going to stop you and say, sorry, buddy, I hope you make it while I write this ticket, right? Because they know this is a pressing need. Now they'll probably say you should have called an ambulance or called 911 or something. You shouldn't have just done it yourself. But the point is, there are times of duress, times of great need, when the rules don't apply the same way. And we should have common sense to know that, right? It takes common sense. And perhaps that's what Jesus is so annoyed with so often with people, is how much longer do I have to put up with you? He calls them twisted generation, crooked generation. I think what he means is shallow people who won't ask why, but just keep doing what, the word we use, not to get political, but sheeple, right? That's what people say. People who just do what they're told, believe what they're told. And Jesus says, you can't be a faithful disciple and do that. Life doesn't work like that. You become a Pharisee. And Pharisees are not inherently evil. They're just shallow people who do what they've been told without questioning. All right, like I said, that could become its own sermon, but let's move on. Jesus is not in this situation struggling the way David and his mighty men were struggling. He's not a Levitical priest, nor are his disciples. So even the stories he quotes are not evidence that he gets to do this. That's not his argument. His argument is, look at the examples where the rule could be broken, and then let me tell you why I get to break it. And then he makes a statement very clear. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. So his authority over the Sabbath is why he gets to break the Sabbath. And by that he means I'm not breaking it at all. It's mine. I can't break it if it's mine. I'm the one who gets to use it. And that makes us question this incarnate God, Jesus. What is he saying about the Sabbath? I'm going to speed through the rest of the sermon. Here's a question. Why did God give the law to begin with? Why did God give the law? And the answer is to guide his people into a new life of freedom. So if you ever question the law of Moses, Leviticus, all these rules, where do they come from? The Israelites come out of Egypt as slave people. They've been slaves for centuries. And if you, even in the chattel slavery of the U.S., in our not so distant past, if you consider African Americans who were set free, many of them had no idea what to do after they were set free, because when all you've known is slavery, someone has to help you and educate you to live a different sort of free life. Many of them had to go back to their masters and work for pennies. They weren't slaves anymore, but they didn't have anywhere else to go. That's Israel. They've come out of slavery and they don't have anywhere else to go. They don't know what to do. They don't know who they are. It will take a generation in the wilderness to figure out what it means to no longer be slaves before they can inherit a free land. Okay? In that story, God gives them a law, a bunch of rules, but they're not just rules. There's wisdom, there's lessons for life, there's order and methods to keep order in society and to judge cases. And basically, he's designing a system of life for a people who have not been civilized on their own. It's very complicated. It's not just a list of rules. The law, in that case, is a gift to help the Israelites become their own people group. That's a big deal. It was a gift to help, not a noose to hang them with. But that's what it would become. And in the midst of that is a law about the Sabbath. And what Jesus reminds us is that Sabbath wasn't originally a Mosaic law. It was originally a law of creation itself. It's maybe the only law that we can trace back to the very beginning. God creates for 6 days, which is, of course, a big allegory or metaphor for the order of the universe and the way we have weeks and everything else. And on the seventh day, what does he do? He rests. But he rests with his people. So the ultimate hope is day 7 rest. And guess what never gets to come to fruition? Day 7. He orders days 1 through 6, and then day 7 shows up and he doesn't get to enjoy it because it's spoiled by sin. The whole story of the Bible is getting Sabbath back. That's the whole story of Scripture, is to get Sabbath again, to have Sabbath like we never got to have it to begin with. Day 7 rest. It's a metaphor for what God intended all along, which is peace and restoration with his people. Blessing and healing and redeeming, restoring the good creation. So we should start then with the premise that God's intentions are good to help, not to hinder or harm. Because we often start with God as this judge who's waiting to catch us doing the bad thing and punish us. Don't start there. Start with God being a benevolent parent who's waiting to bless you and help you and encourage you in the right way. So then Jesus asks with that new mindset as the Lord of the Sabbath, reminding us that it was always God's intention to restore all of this, that the law was just one step in that process. He then says, it is good to do good on the Sabbath. What I'm doing is Sabbath work. They ask him, is it lawful? And he says, what do you think? I think he's saying, you bunch of idiots? Like, how do you not see this? Of course, it's always good to do good. When is it ever bad to do good? That's how lost these people are. And I know Christians like that who are so blinded by their legalism, by their rules, that it's nonsensical and they don't even realize how silly what they're saying is. Of course, it's good to do good all the time. So you answered correctly earlier. Yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath because compassion always ranks above ritual in the economy of God. Muntz, in his commentary, writes that freedom from ritual commandment shouldn't lead to moral chaos. It doesn't need to do that. Within the kingdom of God, instead, our freedom in God's kingdom imposes a responsibility far greater than any law could ever demand. Meaning Christian freedom is not the lack of responsibility. It's not antinomian. You could just do whatever you want. That means without law. It's more than the law. Jesus takes the rules of Moses and he says, I'm telling you it's even more than that. You think cheating on a spouse is bad. I'm telling you it's just the lustful intention of your heart that's the problem. Now, he doesn't say that because he thinks you're going to ever get over lust completely. He's saying it's the root of the human that's messed up. We are sin sick. We have a problem. And God isn't here to remind you how messed up you are. He's here to heal you, to help you. Jesus didn't come to take the law away, but to fulfill it. He says, I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And then elsewhere he says, take my yoke upon you. It's easy. My burden, it's light. Imposing the law on people was heavy. It weighed them down. They couldn't carry it. He says, I've come to help you. Not to take it away, but to help you do it. He didn't come to tell you how impossible it is for you to actually love God and love your neighbors and love yourself. He came to help you actually do those things. Why aren't people saying that? It's like every sermon I hear anymore is just how humans will never be able to love God or love their neighbor or love themselves, so you better just cling to Jesus until he saves you out of this hellhole. Just better pray harder and show up at church every week and hope that he can get you out of here. Jesus didn't say that. He said, I've come to show you how to do it. I'm going to give you an example of someone who loves God and loves his neighbors the way he loves himself. And he says, now do that. Follow me. Take my path. The Gospel of Mark adds a phrase that Matthew doesn't that I really like. He says, Jesus, in the midst of all this, Jesus was grieved in his heart during this encounter. That phrase reminds me of one other place that I find it in Genesis. At Noah's flood, it says that the intention of humankind became evil all the time. So human intention in their hearts was always evil. And in that case, it's a reference to hurting one another and taking from one another and trying to seize power and whatever they could. Everybody was just selfish all the time. And so God says it grieved him to his heart. Now, some of your Bibles say he regretted making humankind upon the earth, but it actually says it grieved him to his heart that he had made mankind upon the earth. God, in the same way that I don't regret having kids when they hurt me, when they disappoint me, I don't think God regretted making humans, but it hurt his heart. God felt pain. God is passible. The impassibility of God, that he can't feel anything, is bogus. God tells us all over the place he feels. He feels. He hurts with you. He hurts for you because he's a good parent. God desires mercy over sacrifice. When all we care about is rules and sacrifice, and we forget how to love God and love our neighbors as we love ourselves. It grieves God. Jesus says, just love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. If you can figure that out, the law, everything the prophets ever said, it'll all fall into place. It'll all hang on that. It'll make sense. It'll work. How does that change the way you practice your own faith? If that's true, that if all the rules could be captured in that, love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love God with all you have and love your neighbor as you love yourself. You've heard it a million times. If that really does capture all of the law, all the rules that God ever intended, how would that change the way you practice your Christian faith? Perhaps the greatest law Jesus has ever fulfilled is the Sabbath law, because Sabbath was that ultimate hope for creation. It's wrapped up in the Sabbath times Sabbath, the 7 times 7th year, the 49th year, right? The year of Jubilee in the Jewish calendar. If you're not familiar, it's the year when all debts are forgiven, all family lands are returned to the appropriate tribal lines and families, all slaves are set free every 49 years. The Sabbath times Sabbath, 7 times 7. Every time that year happens, that's supposed to happen. Everything gets reset, restored, made right. There's no evidence that it ever actually happened, not even once. But it was a teaching God gave his people. That's one of the rules they did not follow, because that rule would have upended all the other rules that they made. And maybe that was God's whole point. He said, if I'm going to make a rule, it's a rule that's there to save you and help you and heal you. The rules you make don't usually do that very well. The year of Jubilee is captured in the phrase that you still hear in Israel today, Shabbat Shalom, the peace of the Sabbath. The peace of the Sabbath. It's ultimate hope. It's restoration. It's God's peace for humanity, a foretaste of the world to come, the new heavens and the new earth. It's the ultimate Sabbath. Sabbath was never meant to just be a day of rules and regulations. Sabbath should never hinder. It should help us to love God and love our neighbors more. A day set aside to rest from the labors of a fallen world and to maintain hope of a world that is yet to be, of the new heavens and the new earth, of the ultimate Sabbath. So we're told over and over again in the commandments, remember the Sabbath. Would you stand with me as we close this morning? The word remember in English is actually a good translation. We just don't think of it directly translated. Remember literally means put the members back together. It's a reference to like dismembered bodies being joined back together. Like if your arm was cut off and they sewed it back on, it has been remembered. Make sense? It's a good word. It's a good word. It's a biblical word. So then if we're remembering, what are we remembering? What are we putting back together? Perhaps it's these things that the Sabbath teaches us about God and about ourselves, that we're never finished growing or working. We take a day of rest because we have to be prepared to continue to work. That process never ends. There's always room to grow. Secondly, we're part of an ordered universe that has rhythms. God created things with purpose. It's not meaningless. It's not nihilism where nothing matters. It matters. Everything matters. And the day of rest is a reminder of the rhythms of life that keep us healthy, that keep us on pace. That day of rest is important. And it reminds us that we're not defined by what we do, by what we have, or what people say about us, which are the temptations that Jesus faced, right? What we do, what we have, what people think about us. That's why you have trouble honoring a Sabbath day if you try to honor one. Because the thought in your mind is, I could be doing more, I could have more, I could impress people more. To cease from all of that and just be is difficult. It's difficult. I think the Lord's Supper functions much like the Sabbath. In fact, it seems to be Jesus' answer to the Jewish Sabbath is the Christian table of fellowship. He even uses the same phrase, remember. As often as you come together, do this in remembrance of me. He doesn't leave us guessing what we're putting back together. It's his body. It's Christ and his church being remembered over and over again, put back together over and over again. Jesus explains the hope of Sabbath, the hope of God's intention for all of humanity, for the creation. His love for us is bound up in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, it was a Sabbath day that Jesus lay in rest in the tomb. That's no accident. That he's crucified on Friday and then laid to rest for the Sabbath day. And it's only after the day of rest that he can rise with new power, new life in resurrected form. The Sabbath was necessary. The Sabbath was the whole point, because once we rest with God, new life emerges. Yeah, this world is dying. Every day it's dying. You're born dying. That's dark, I know, it's morbid, but it's true. So you get that, right? You come out of the womb dying. You're born, and then you know you're going to die. You get what I'm saying? I'm talking this to death. It's really quite simple. Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath is the same as his teaching at this table, that we will all live, we will all die, but in the dying, in the resting, in the coming to peace with God, we will then live again. But only because Jesus has fulfilled the Sabbath. That's what we remember at this table, that he has done what we did not do, perhaps what we could not do, at the very least what we would not do. Jesus has done it. And he leads us as dying people back to the Sabbath, where every week, even in these elements, he gives the Spirit of God a chance to inject new life into those dying people, to resurrect us again and again in a pattern of utter and absolute dependence on God, which was really the whole point of the Sabbath, was to live with God in dependence on God and to enjoy God forever. In many ways, that's what this table teaches us, if we would listen.